It was sunrise, and the whole of Scatterbrook Farm was waking up to face a new day. The loud cawing of the rooks filled the air, and a cockerel perched on a nearby gate opened his beak and emitted a loud and happy "Cock-a-doodle-doo," immediately ducking to avoid a large boot thrown at him by an unseen hand from a farmhouse bedroom window. In 10-acre Field, the umbrella dangling from Worzel's scarecrow pole swung harmlessly in the breeze. But of Worzel himself there was no sign. Where was Worzel? It was then that the bedroom window opened, and there was Worzel, looking thoroughly at home as he buttoned up his waistcoat in the open window. He scowled at the cockerel.
"Dangnation, cockerel, waking up a body at all hours," he grumbled. "Any more of that, and you'll finish up in a cooking pot, so you will."
He was about to retreat into the bedroom when his nostrils twitched. He turned back to the window and looked down at the pig outside, snuffling happily away on the farmhouse step. Worzel breathed in luxuriously.
"Now that's what I call a drop of fresh air, that there is. Nothing like fresh air with a breath of pig in it."
He produced the little Robin Redbreast who lived in his stomach and stroked it.
"Here you are, Robin Redbreast. Have a good breathe. That's it. Fill up your little lungs."
As Worzel and the robin breathed in and out, the bedroom window next to Worzel's was thrown open, and a severe-looking Aunt Sally, wearing an old-fashioned nightgown and a mob-cap, appeared. She glared at him. Worzel smiled.
"Morning, Aunt Sally."
"And what on earth do you think you're a-doing of, you ridiculous scarecrow?" Worzel breathed in.
"Breathe in, Aunt Sally," he said,
as he breathed out. Aunt Sally's lips parted in a superior smile. "Oh," she said, "breathe in, are we? And whom gave you permission to breathe, may I beg leave to ask?"
"Nobody, Aunt Sally."
"Then stop breathing," she ordered triumphantly, "and go and get my breakfast." Worzel smiled his ingratiating smile.
"I'll do that right away, Aunt Sally. It'll be a honor and a privilege."
He turned away, but Aunt Sally hadn't finished with him yet. "And Gummidge," she said loftily. He spun round.
"Yes, Aunt Sally?"
"I don't want to find you boiling eggs in the teapot again." For his answer, Worzel looked furtively down at the pig, snuffling on the doorstep, looked both ways, and then said in a low voice,
"'Tain't boiled eggs this morning, Aunt Sally. I got a special treat for you, so I have."
"What are you whispering for?" demanded Aunt Sally. "I can't stand them what whispers. It's common." Worzel cupped his hand to his mouth and said in an even lower voice,
"I don't want the pig to hear, Aunt Sally."
The pig looked up inquisitively at the two open bedroom windows, but Aunt Sally didn't care about his feelings. "I refuse to consider the finer feelings of a flippin' pig," she screamed. "Kindly tell me in plain Yakety what is for breakfast."
"Sausages," whispered
Worzel. That did it. Aunt Sally jumped in the air, clapping her hands together with delight. "Sausages!" she screamed ecstatically. The pig heard that all right, and turned away in disgust. The word sausages, that was the very last thing he wanted to know about. Sausages, indeed. He shambled off hurriedly, scattering hens in his wake. The sooner he was away from here, the better.
"Here, now look what you've been and gone and done," said Worzel.
"I don't care," shrieked Aunt Sally. "Sausages! Oh, what bliss! I shall have 12, with toast, marmalade, pepper, and salt and cream cakes." Worzel took the order.
"Cream cakes," he memorized. "Pepper and salt, toast and marmalade, and 12 sausages."
"At once, Gummidge." Worzel nodded.
"Right away, Aunt Sally," he said.
As a beaming Aunt Sally left her window and went back into her room, Worzel stayed where he was at the open window, lost in his favourite dream.
"Who'd have thought it, Robin Redbreast?" he murmured. "Me and Aunt Sally, all nice and snug in our own little home, and old Worzel being allowed to make our breakfast."
And then his smile began to fade, and a worried frown took its place.
Aunt Sally," he called. "Aunt Sally."
An irritable Aunt Sally reappeared at her window almost immediately, irritably combing her hair with a hedgehog. "What is it now, you tiresome scarecrow?"
"How many's 12?"
asked Worzel. She looked at him with scorn in her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake, don't you know what 12 sausages is?" He shook his head.
Well, this ain't me counting, Ed, you see, he said, pointing to it.
She looked upwards in exasperation.
It's all of them!
Worzel smiled gratefully for this information, generously showing his upper and blackened tooth to all nature. Then he left the bedroom. It was breakfast time, and Aunt Sally was hungry. Not long after Worzel had gone to prepare breakfast for Aunt Sally, a station wagon, its roof rack piled high with luggage, pulled into the forecourt of a transport cafe. As it did so, happy voices could be heard singing inside it. "You push the damper in and you pull the damper out," they sang as the car drew up to a halt. If Worzel had known that this particular car, bringing the Braithwaites, Mr. Peters, and John and Sue back from their holidays, was only 12 miles away from Scatterbrook in a transport cafe car park, his straw would have run cold in his veins. But he didn't know, and remained blissfully happy in Mrs. Braithwaite's kitchen as the party left and locked the car and went into the cafe. Meanwhile, back in the farmhouse kitchen at Scatterbrook Farm, and happily unaware of what might well be impending disaster, Worzel was pottering about, surrounded by disastrous signs of previous potterings. A pile of unwashed crockery stood on the draining board. Remnants of food and opened packages lay strewn about the floor, and the whole kitchen looked as if it had been hit by a hurricane. Worzel himself had arranged a breakfast tray for Aunt Sally with cream cakes and condiments on it, and was unwrapping a packet of sausages, quietly counting them to himself.
1, 3, 14, 11 to 2, 9, 6, 12.
He gave a deep sigh as he came to the last sausage and looked at them longingly. Then he held up the string of sausages in front of him and gave another sigh.
Could have done with a sausage or 3 myself, so I could. So perhaps Aunt Sally'll give me one when she sees how nice I's made her toast.
And arranging the string of sausages on a plate, Worzel lovingly began to cut inch-thick slices of bread that wouldn't go into anyone's toaster, let alone Mrs. Braithwaite's. By this time, John and Sue and Mr. Peters, together with Mr. and Mrs. Braithwaite, were tucking into a bacon and egg breakfast at the Transport Cafe. They were all happy and thoroughly enjoying themselves, with one notable exception, Mr. Braithwaite.
"Call this bacon?"
he exclaimed angrily. Mrs. Braithwaite gave him an understanding smile.
"Oh, never mind," she said. "Tomorrow morning you can sit down to a nice plate of your own home-cured ham." "But I don't see why I couldn't have sat down to it this morning. We're only 12 miles from Scatterbrook," Mr. Braithwaite complained.
"Because I don't want to be cooking the minute I get back," said Mrs. Braithwaite.
"And anyway, I don't suppose Harry would have thought to fill up the larder." "Ah, there you are, you see," said Mr. Braithwaite to Mr. Peters triumphantly. 2 weeks ago it was a case of, "Oh, don't worry, Harry will look after the farm. You can leave it all to Harry." Now it turns out she doesn't even trust him to fill up the larder.
Mrs. Braithwaite refused to be annoyed.
"Oh, eat your breakfast and stop moaning," she said mildly. "Moan, moan, moan, that's all we've had for a fortnight."
Sue winked at John. "He wasn't moaning in Tenerife, Mrs. Braithwaite."
"Not much," said John. "Only 24 hours a day."
Mr. Peters raised a schoolmastery finger at the children from behind Mr. Braithwaite's back and waggled it from side to side sternly. They straightened their faces and smiled politely. Mr. Braithwaite, immersed in his problems and thoughts, didn't notice anyway.
"Oh, he's not milking them cows proper," he grumbled. "I know it in me bones. Oh, well, it's my own fault. I should never have let you talk me into it," he frowned. "Farmers shouldn't have holidays," he said. "It's against the laws of nature."
Mrs. Braithwaite smiled a worldly smile at Mr. Peters and John and Sue. "What should they have? Nervous breakdowns from working too hard, then?" Mr. Peters, sensing trouble, cut in hastily.
"This holiday's done us all a world of good, Mr. Braithwaite, you included."
He smiled around the table at everyone reassuringly.
"And I'm sure Mrs. Braithwaite's right. You've left Scatterbrook in the safest hands."
Mr. Braithwaite refused to be comforted.
"Don't you believe it. If I know Harry, he'll have been straight round the coach and horses the minute our backs were turned."
Mr. Peters shook his head knowingly.
"No, I can state that categorical. He never goes to the coach and horses."
Mrs. Braithwaite was triumphant. "You see," she said.
"He uses the wheat sheaf," said Mr. Peters.
By this time, Aunt Sally's breakfast was just about ready. Worzel had gone outside to the farmhouse and pulled up a bunch of flowers with loving hands, and as he stuffed them into a jam jar, he looked at them admiringly and thought,
"Ah, a breakfast fit for a queen."
Proudly he took the flowers into the hall, put them on the breakfast tray on the hall table, picked up the tray, and carried it upstairs to Aunt Sally's bedroom. Aunt Sally was sitting at the dressing table, painting her face, when Worzel kicked open the bedroom door. Well, if he'd tried to knock at the door, Worzel had worked out, he'd have dropped the tray.
Enter!"
cried Aunt Sally regally, and Worzel dutifully entered.
"Thank you, Gummidge," said Aunt Sally without turning. "Put it on the table, and I'll eat it all in a minute."
Worzel smiled happily.
There he is, Aunt Sally, and I hope she enjoys every mouthful."
He looked longingly at the sausages. They were just the right size for his mouth. Aunt Sally wouldn't miss just one.
"If you want anything else,"
he said pointedly, but politely,
"I'll be downstairs, having a dry crust of bread."
Aunt Sally didn't bat an eye at this sad bit of news.
"Never you mind feeding your face, Gummidge," she said unfeelingly. "You have work to do, so take my pretty shoes and polish them till you can see your ugly face in them."
Worzel masked his feelings.
"Yes, Aunt Sally. My pleasure."
It was about this time that the Braithwaites and the Peters were getting back into their station wagon at the Transport Cafe, replenished by their hearty breakfast.
"Are you looking forward to getting back, children?"
asked Mrs. Braithwaite. Sue grinned. "I wonder if Worzel will still be there."
"Oh, dear?"
Nobody," said John quickly.
Mr. Nobody, he means," grunted their father. "It's that pet name of that scarecrow, you know."
Mr. Braithwaite, who was as happy as when they were having their breakfast, had other things on his mind.
"Oh, never mind that scarecrow. Will my cow still be there? That's what I'm worrying about."
Worzel, happily polishing Aunt Sally's shoes, and liberally smearing himself with shoe polish at the same time, looked up as the kitchen door was kicked open by a furious Aunt Sally carrying the breakfast tray.
"Look at these sausages. They're raw."
"Raw? What's that mean, Aunt Sally, raw?"
"It means they aren't cooked."
"Well, of course they ain't cooked, you daft-looking clothes prop,"
snapped Worzel indignantly.
"You don't think I was going to light that there cooking machine and set myself on fire, do you?"
Aunt Sally threw the sausages angrily into the frying pan.
"It's the same every morning. If I want any cooking done, I have to do it myself, like a common pantry maid."
Worzel eyed the sausages in the pan hopefully.
"Here, you going to eat all them sausages yourself, Aunt Sally?"
"Yes, I am. And you can go down to the village and buy some more, and some more cream cakes, and some more chocolate. There's some money in the box over there."
Worzel shambled towards the door.
"Here, when they comes back from their holidays, there'll be ructions if they finds us here."
"And why should they, you stupid scarecrow? We'll hear them coming in their motor car. Now hurry up. I'm going to put some more rouge on my pretty face while the sausages is frying."
Worzel, his ears alert for the slightest sound of humans approaching, was about to cross the farmyard on his way back to the village, when he stopped dead in his tracks. They were back. The Braithwaites and the Peters were back. He could hear them coming. He looked round frantically. But there was no time to warn Aunt Sally, only time to do one thing, and he did it. He became a scarecrow again. He was just in time, for as he froze against the wall, around the corner came John and Sue, followed by their elders, with Mr. Braithwaite shooing Percy the pig into his sty.
"Just look at this yard," complained Mrs. Braithwaite. "Harry's not been near it. Never mind taking the brush to it."
John and Sue had spotted Worzel and tried to shield him from the eagle-eyed Mrs. Braithwaite, but she'd already seen him.
"Now, who brought that thing down here? I'm going to clear up the yard and have a big bonfire, and that scarecrow can start it off."
The thought of being a bonfire didn't go down too well with Worzel, and it needed all his willpower to stop shaking. There was the thought of Aunt Sally being caught, too. The situation was desperate. He tried to catch John and Sue's attention by moving his head ever so slightly, as if it was moved by the wind.
"Right, come along, Mr. Peters," said Mr. Braithwaite. "I'll go and tear Harry off a strip for this, if you'll get the luggage from the car. What are you kids going to do, then?"
Worzel, as if the wind was rustling through his straw. Sue could see the agonized Worzel's head nodding imperceptibly towards Aunt Sally's bedroom window. And there was Aunt Sally, completely oblivious to the return of the Braithwaites, making herself up. Said Sue, nudging John. We'll stay and help Mrs. Braithwaite. Worzel breathed with relief. But Worzel breathed too soon. Sue and John had rescued him, but they hadn't been able to do anything about Aunt Sally, who had been found by Mr. Braithwaite and unceremoniously dumped outside in the yard. Completely ungrateful for this timely rescue, he glowered at John and Sue from the safety of the farmhouse wall.
A fat lot of use usury was, I must say. Now he's been and gone and caught me Aunt Sally red-handed.
Well, at any rate, we did rescue you, said John. Another few minutes, and you'd have been thrown onto the... He paused. On the you-know-what. At this moment, Mrs. Cousins, who'd just taken Rose Cottage on the green, cycled up to Mr. Braithwaite, who was standing infuriated in the yard. I wonder who this is, said Sue, very curious. Worzel closed his eyes guiltily.
No use asking me. I sulking.
As Mrs. Cousins dismounted from her bicycle, Mr. Braithwaite stood looking at the lifeless form of Aunt Sally and still raving about the mess in the kitchen. Vandalism, that's all it is, he shouted. There's neither sense nor reason in it. It seemed that Mrs. Cousins had come to buy a dozen eggs, and looked very put out when Mrs. Braithwaite informed her, well, we don't sell eggs from the door any more, my dear. We have an arrangement with the dairy in the village. Then, who's been selling me a dozen eggs twice a week for the last fortnight? Only Worzel and Aunt Sally could have answered that one. It was then that Mrs. Cousins noticed Aunt Sally. You know, properly renovated, that would make a most unusual doll, she remarked. I don't suppose you'd care to sell it, would you? Mr. Braithwaite shook his head. Oh, it's not ours to sell. Well, sure, if you went round with it to Mr. Shepherd's, he'd quote you a price. And then he chuckled and added, only take my tip. See him before you've painted it up, not after. Otherwise he'll charge you double. Mrs. Cousins' departure on her bicycle with Aunt Sally sitting in the carrier basket didn't go unnoticed by John and Sue and Worzel, who had now revived from his sulk. He bowed stiffly to John and Sue, raised his hat and said, well, W were E were L were L Worzel, N were I were C were E Worzel, T were O were dip, S were E were dip, Y were O were U were dip. What's all that mean? Asked John.
Don't you remember nothing, you ignorant little human? S were the least of, well, nice to see ye. As how Scarecrow says goodbye when they're running away.
Running away? Asked Sue. Why? If Worzel could have blushed, he'd have blushed now.
Why, it's on account of me Aunt Sally. Wheresoever Aunt Sally goes, Worzel goes. I's off to follow that there woman and see where she takes her.
Sue sniggered. You won't catch it when the Crowman hears you've gone. Worzel gulped nervously.
Well, maybe I will, maybe I won't. Anyways, you'll have to find me first, missy.
The Crowman, did Worzel but know, was half an hour later sitting in the Braithwaite's kitchen, delicately sipping tea from a saucer while Mrs. Braithwaite tidied up the mess. Whereas Worzel, did the Crowman but know, had passed the Crowman on his way to Mrs. Cousins' house on the green. Oh, that's all I can tell you up to press, said Mrs. Braithwaite. The Aunt Sally was dumped in her bedroom, and that scarecrow of yours was propped up outside. I blame squatters. We'll have to see what Police Constable Parsons makes of it all. The Crowman sipped thoughtfully at his tea. And you don't know where the scarecrow is at present, marm? She shook her head. Oh, if it isn't squatters shifting it about, it's the children. And if it isn't children, it's trespassers. We find it miles away sometimes. The Crowman finished his tea and got to his feet, thanking Mrs. Braithwaite on the way out. As he left Scatterbrook Farm on his tricycle, he smiled a grim smile. After seeing Aunt Sally being carted off on Mrs. Cousins' bicycle, he had a very good idea of where to find Worzel, if he was in time. But Rose Cottage wasn't very far. A malevolent Worzel peered over the garden shrubbery of Rose Cottage, watching Mrs. Cousins' snooty little daughter Emma giving a dolly's tea party on the lawn to Teddy, Golly, a rag doll, and Aunt Sally. As he watched, Mrs. Cousins called from the back door window. "A tea in 5 minutes, Emma." "We're already having tea," screamed Emma. "I mean real tea, darling," smiled Mrs. Cousins. "This is real tea," shouted back Emma. Worzel sneered to himself as he saw Emma pretending to pour tea and offer cakes to her guests.
Real tea, is it? Well, it ain't real proper tea. That's a powerful cruel thing to do to my Aunt Sally, that there is, giving her cups of tea and slices of cake. What ain't cups of tea and slices of cake should be a law agin it.
Mrs. Cousins was becoming impatient. "Emma, will you come in at once and wash your hands?" she shouted. And Emma, placing her doll Jemima in Aunt Sally's hands, disappeared inside the house. This was Worzel's chance. As soon as the door closed behind Emma, Worzel clambered over the fence and into the garden. Quickly seizing Aunt Sally by the ankle, he dragged her across the grass, pausing only to shout to the teddy bear,
"And don't you tell nobody where we've gone, Master Teddy Bear, else I'll come back here and kick the living sawdust out of you. Come on, Aunt Sally."
Little realizing that the Crowman had just walked up the path to the front door of Rose Cottage, Worzel dragged a struggling Aunt Sally up the lane. "Let me go!" she screamed. "Worzel, let me go, before you scratch all my pretty paint!"
"I'll let you go, all right, Aunt Sally, now as you come back to life again. Thought you was having a good long sulk, so I did."
She struggled to her feet, looked at Jemima, the rag doll in her arms, and threw it back into Rose Cottage's garden. "I shall have a sulk when I can find a minute to sulk in. But first I shall have to go and see my dressmaker. Just look what you've done to my new pretty frock, you stupid hayrick." This really hurt Worzel.
"Stupid, eh, Rick? After rescuing you?"
"Well, how do you know that I wanted to be rescued? Poking your big, long carrot nose in. It just so happens that I was living with some very delightful people. Quite charming they was. Well-spoken, quite la-di-da, you know, with proper manners and shining furniture." Worzel was incensed.
But they didn't give you proper cups of tea and proper slices of cake, Aunt Sally, did they? 'Cause I seen them not doing it. And maybe I is a stupid Eric, and maybe I don't speak yakety old la-di-da, and maybe old Worzel's barn has a leaking roof and none of that there shining furniture. But I promise you this, Aunt Sally, you come along with your old Worzel, and you'll have cups of tea and slices of cake fit to bust your buttons off.
"Don't be coarse," said Aunt Sally. "What kind of cake?"
Chocolate cake?"
"With cream?"
"Oh, aye," said Worzel, grinning.
"And upside-down cake?"
"And right-side-up cake."
"And what else?" Worzel reeled them off in rapid succession.
Cheesecake, and 72 kinds of cheesecake, and tea cake, and breakfast cake, and dinner cake, and
so he went on, not realizing that at this very minute the Crowman was talking to Mrs. Cousins at Rose Cottage and hot on Worzel's track. "But I still don't see, Mr. Crowman," said Mrs. Cousins, "why you think your scarecrow might turn up in my garden." "Why indeed, ma'am," replied the Crowman. "You might as well ask who'd want to steal a worm-eaten, weather-beaten old Aunt Sally." Mrs. Cousins was staggered. "Steal an Aunt Sally, did you say?" "From the County Folk Museum, ma'am, of which I have the honour to be curator," said the Crowman glibly. "Of course it could be argued that a rare, antique Aunt Sally is of much more value than a common scarecrow." "Oh, dear," sighed Mrs. Cousins. I think you'd better come through into the garden." By this time, Worzel and Aunt Sally had almost exhausted the list of their favourite cakes. "And birthday cake, Worzel," she screamed. "Don't forget birthday cake."
"Oh, aye," said Worzel shyly, taking his hat off. And one more kind of cake as you've missed out, Aunt Sally."
She pondered for a moment. "One more kind of cake?
Let me see.
Chocolate cake, cream cake, strawberry cake? No, I can't think of another kind of cake, Worzel." Worzel said, very softly,
"Wedding cake, Aunt Sally. Wedding cake."
Aunt Sally seemed to be gazing into Worzel's eyes with pure ecstasy. Worzel swallowed a lump in his throat.
"Why, Aunt Sally, you'll set me off weeping and blubbering if he looks at me like that. 'Cause I've never been looked at like that since the day I got made."
Aunt Sally, still transfixed, murmured quietly, But I'm not looking at you at all, you stupid ignoramus. I'm looking at what's behind you. And she suddenly screamed, "The fair! The fair! Wait for me! Wait for me!" Worzel ran after her in a panic.
"But you hates fairs, Aunt Sally. They chucks wooden balls at your head. Don't you remember? Think of what you're a-doing of. Think of all them cakes we was going to have. There'll be no cakes at the fair."
But Aunt Sally kept running after the fair, with Worzel desperately chasing her.
"I'll just have to make do with gingerbread men, toffee apples and lemonade then, won't I?" she shouted. "Goodbye, Worzel."
Worzel, seeing Aunt Sally jump onto the tailboard of a truck, was about to give up when he suddenly saw the Crowman's unattended tricycle standing in front of Rose's cottage. Raising his hat reverently to the Crowman, he said,
"Forgive your old Worzel, Mr. Crowman, your effervescence, but my need is greater."
And he hopped onto the tricycle and pedalled furiously off after Aunt Sally. As he pedalled away, Worzel heard the Crowman's stentorian voice behind him shouting, "Worzel! Worzel Gummidge!" Worzel merely raised his hat politely, his eyes fixed on Aunt Sally.
"That's me, your crowmanship," he shouted. "And where I was see where he were so, tea were over dip, as for he were dip, why were over you were dip."
Which, as you all know, is Worzelese for
"Nice to see you."